Hello everyone, welcome back to Sarah Vllo. My name is Sarah and this here's my channel. So you're probably wondering, girl, where have you been for a month? Yeah, we've been struggling. Just a lot of schoolwork, and then I had a lot of work to do, and I've been volunteering. I've just been doing it all and having post-grad applications to everything. So your girl was so busy, and then I had no motivation to make a YouTube video, which is such a bummer because I actually love it. So then I freaking have the Adobe package and it charges me $27 a month, and every time I see that $27, I'm like, I need to get my money's worth. I need to film a YouTube video and use it. So here we are. Also, it says Sarah, so I just had to point that out. I just had a shower, so I'm like a fresh babe. But anyways, yeah, so sorry for disappearing. I won't do that again. That was really mean. So today's video, we're going to be talking about the history of museums. It's a fun topic because you guys are going to learn a lot, since I learned a lot. When I've been researching the history of the museum, the modern museum. How did she come to be? Let's dive into that. But we're going to be doing this while I paint my nails because I just can't focus on one thing at a time. That's simply the truth. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be painting our nails this color. The shade is Air Dry. Vllo. Okay. This girl. Doesn't even matter if it focuses or not. This is the shade. Pretty Lady. And then we're gonna have an accent nail that will be this shade, which is Hard Bitten. That's just, I don't know. I would have called it like Cloud Merryweather. You know, like what is this? Hard Bitten? Anyways. And then we have our precious clear coat, which is called Strong Start. Wrapped by Essie today, so go us. And I have my trusty dusty. What is this? It's the salted caramel cold foam cold brew. I think I've been drinking this for the past 4 hours, but I'm a sipper, so this is what happens to us sippers. We drink our coffee all day, but get our money's worth, you know? Like I paid $7 and I'm really gonna get my $7 worth. Okay, anyways, let's get started, shall we? We're starting with our base coat. I'm not gonna be showing you, I'm just gonna be painting my hands like up here. Because honestly, I'd rather you see my face and my hands. It's not because my hands are crusty. It's because my face is really pretty. Anyways, so the history of the museum. So the word museum is derived from the Greek word, which, okay, I don't speak Greek. I think it's, what do I have here? Like, museum? I'll put the spelling for any of you Greek watchers. Fix my pronunciation, please. Anyway, so it's derived from that word museum, which basically means a place or a space where all the muses are present. You're probably like, hey, but what are the muses? Well, also Greek listener, please correct my pronunciation of all the muses. I'm a French speaker. I'm not a Greek speaker. Sorry, babes. So the 9 muses, there is Calliope, which is epic poetry, Cleo, who is Clear, who is history, Euterpe, who is the flutes and music, Talia, who is comedy and pastoral poetry, Melpanini, who is tragedy, Terpsichore is dance, Erato is love poetry and lyric poetry, Polyhymnia is sacred poetry, and Urania is astronomy. So basically, if you have all these girl bosses together, you have a museum, since all the muses are having a nice little kiki. So that's where the word museum comes from. First recorded museum in history is Enigaldi Nana's Museum. Okay, I've never heard of this woman before, but I also don't study ancient history. It's more modern history, obviously. So Enigaldi was the princess of the Babylonian Empire. Her dad was King Nabonidus of the Babylonian Empire, I guess. And so she was kicking it around 530 BCE, so quite a while ago. And basically she created this museum that had relics from, from Mesopotamia, before that, after that, just to give her, allow herself to have historical interpretation of the family dynastic heritage. So she would reflect on the family's power through these artifacts that have been passed through the dynasty, through the lineage, which is pretty cool. Now you're probably wondering, okay, how does that constitute a museum? Well, she actually had signs. So we're doing the other hand now. She had signs all around the museum that were categorizing what the objects were, and it would say, oh, this is from this period, much like a modern museum categorizes all the works within it. So that is pretty cool, but let's not forget that was all the way in 530 BCE. Sarah is a more recent example of a museum. Yes, there is. And it is 280 BC. So, 300 years later, that's still something. Anyways, this was the famously lost library at Alexandria, which is such a flop that we don't have it, because that would have been the coolest library ever. I mean, the collection is spread all around the world in private and public collections and private and public institutions, but it would be really nice to have all the known artifacts that were in there in one place, to have a nice exhibit about that. I'll be reaching out to all the curators pretty soon. So yeah, and so basically the Museum and Library Alexandria was a building specifically set apart for study of the arts, and so this institution was specifically designed for studying the arts. Now that's important. Let's think about the idea of studying the arts. Sort of the same with Enigaldi's museum. It was specifically designed to study and reflect and contemplate the family's history. So what we're seeing from museums initially is it's just sort of a way to interact with the arts, contemplate, and a place for academia, really. So the Library at Alexandria was built under Ptolemy I at around 280 BC. And it was just this big library in Egypt. In case you didn't know where Alexandria is, it is in good old modern-day Egypt. So after that, museums and libraries kind of laid low. Obviously, the Library at Alexandria changed everything, so everyone was like, Bob, I kind of want this. But they weren't anything special. It was just sort of whatever, just a library, right? Right. So we're going to go ahead and jump to the next most relevant, we're going to let this dry, stage in history, which is the Middle Ages, the medieval period. So we're going to say 1300 to 1500. Okay, so what is this, early Renaissance? Let's not use the word Renaissance. Let's use Middle Ages. So this really is the Middle Ages. So around the Middle Ages, we have the discovery of the New World. We have everyone going to India. We're trying to spice things up. The precursor to colonization. Not a great time in history. It is a great time for museums, but that is because museums are fundamentally based on colonialism. You cannot have a museum without colonialism. It's just how it is. Maybe this breaks your achy breaky heart, but it is true. Museums are a colonial institution. Anyways, around the Middle Ages, when people are bouncing around the globe, these Hashtag Pirates of the Caribbean boats. People are bringing stuff back from either their expeditions, their conquests, their visits. I don't really know what they're doing. I wasn't there. But they're bringing items back. Obviously, this is the wealthy, the elite. This isn't the working class or lower classes that are doing this. This is the upper class, the elite. So they're bringing these objects back, and they're putting them in their big houses and their libraries, and they're having this private collection. And the point of these weren't to be like, oh, look at those inferior people that I took this from. It was more of contemplation. They would look at the objects and sort of try to soak in all the history attached to it. And sort of like museums were encyclopedic. Let's think of it like this way. It's a very good way of thinking about it. If you had a certain object, you had the knowledge and history behind that object. So the more objects you had, the more knowledge and history you had. It was sort of the same with books. The more books you had, the more knowledge you had. So you were becoming an encyclopedia at the same time that the space of the museum and the library were also becoming encyclopedias. So not only were they collecting items from expeditions and travels and conquests and all these, they were also collecting items from Europe as well. So they'd have Italian paintings, French paintings, sculptures, and all these went into their museum, and it was just for the owner to contemplate. It was just allowed them study. So they would study with their, and every museum was attached to a library and a study space, so they could privately study these objects, which is interesting. So the modern museum really wasn't about showing off items. It was about, like, it was a very isolated experience, the museum. Of course, you could have friends over and you could show them your collection, but the point of the collection wasn't to show off. It was a private act of collecting for yourself. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the color, the pigment. So you're probably thinking, okay, so was it only people and private collectors that were collecting? The answer is no. As you know, in humanity and human history, and especially in Europe, since museums are pretty Eurocentric, since they are a colonial institution, this conversation is mostly based in Europe. Anyway, so the church, of course, is like a huge institution within European culture, especially at this time, since this is before the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. And since religion is a huge part of people's lives, the church was also collecting artifacts. They obviously weren't going to be collecting things from Latin America, for example, or various countries in Africa, the African continent, but rather they're collecting literature, artifacts, and art that depicts religious motifs, themes, anything like that. So we have our thumb down. It is a really pretty color, actually. Anyway, so yeah, so churches are collecting. Not only are they collecting, well, this is collecting, but they're also, what is that word? They're also commissioning pieces from artists to make, whatever sort of religious painting, sculpture, piece of visual culture that they want. So yeah, churches, religious institutions are also partaking in collecting. This is especially seen when we get to the Counter-Reformation, when the church will seek out commissions of religious themes and stories to help bring people back to the church. So when you think of Caravaggios or Michelangelos, they were precious back in the day because they were commissioned by a very well-known artist and well-respected artist from a well-respected art institution, but they really were in the church. It was a collection and sort of a museum for members of the religious institution, which is interesting because now when we see a Caravaggio or a Michelangelo, it's sort of a different context. It's more of, okay, this is one of the greats. This is one of the most amazing painters in history. But back in the day, he was just a painter, painting stuff for the church to literally bring back members. So that's interesting. Anyways, so now that we know who's collecting, individuals, religious institutions, then we also have academic institutions who are also collecting. They, I don't know if you know this, but I think this was Victorian era, at least. There was a lot of grave robbings going on, and it wasn't just looting. I mean, obviously that's part of it, but a large part of it was for scientific exploration. They needed cadavers and bodies, so they would steal bodies from graveyards and cemeteries and use those in scientific experiments. They were also, like, Charles Darwin collected taxidermy animals, specimens. Especially academic institutions were doing a lot of collecting, especially in biology. So we're really seeing collecting pop off as sort of part of the culture at this point in Europe. Then we fast forward, and if you think about the modern museum, after, people went broke, things happened, families sold things, but eventually the institution we understand a museum came to be, and they would buy pieces from private collections. So hence why someone like Louis the Seventh, I don't know, whatever he had in his collection is now maybe in the Louvre or in other museums around the world, because it was sold to people and eventually it got into the hands of the museum. Especially works that are very significant in a certain culture are going to be bought by museums 100%. So the Mona Lisa, culturally significant, bought by a museum. There are obviously a lot of private ones, but the museums try to get as much as they can. But of course, we do have private owners putting their pieces on loan. Because this is what it looks like. It's not too bad. I really was going to do an accent nail until I forgot, so we'll just do something else. Yeah, and along with, so museums really started popping off, let's say in the 19th century. Oh, okay. Well, actually a little bit earlier than that. Sort of like 18th century, but in the 19th century they really popped off with the, the Industrial Revolution, and now a huge amount of wealth is being generated from certain individuals. But what I learned recently was, okay, we needed some more history. Have you guys ever heard of like world fairs or exhibitions? If you think of like expos, like Comic-Cons and like whatever other expos that you have in your own cities, those were sort of the world fairs and exhibitions that were going on in the 19th century, and early 20th century. So countries would get together and show their technological advancements, their culture, their scientific advancements, and they would all share it and come together and share all these things. We also had a lot of colonialism going on. A lot of European colonizers would show off like tribes that are in their colonies, or show off the culture of the colony, the food and the animals. Like they got a tiger and they bring that to London and they show it off in the London Expo in the Crystal Palace or something. Yeah, so those were kind of great, but it was like a museum. It was a more interactive museum. People had a lot more fun than they did at traditional museums. There was a lot of food and vendors, and so during this point, people would rather go to these exhibitions and these world fairs than the museum, because who wouldn't? I would. It's way more fun. It's way more fun to be going and seeing what Tesla and Ford are doing than going to look at a Picasso. I mean, I'm totally with that. Getting food. So museums were like, okay, so we got to step it up. So they tried to like enhance engagement, enhance all these things to keep up with the exhibitions. But along with the exhibitions and the museums, there's one other contender in this race. Can you guess who it is? Think 19th century. Think the Bay. Think Bergdorf Goodman. I don't really know. If you said department store, you're right. Department stores, museums, and exhibitions, they go hand in hand together. So the three of them, they weren't competing necessarily, because the same person who goes to an exhibition might not be going to a department store. So let's say you're lower class, you can still go to these exhibitions, but you can't really go to the department store. These were definitely curated and they were meant for the upper class. So elements like in museums, how we would have a themed room. So maybe like a Japanese room, a Chinese room. I'm gonna go with like a Kenyan room. I don't really know. Latin American room. They would have these themed rooms, and department stores also took that idea, and they would have themed rooms. Which is another reason why if you go to department stores, they have like Chanel, Hermes, this. It's them that have the themed rooms. It's the same with putting all the delicate items in glass cases at the front of the store. That sort of is emulated in museums. You can go look at rocks or at jewelry in museums, and it's in those glass cases. Stems out of department stores. So they really grew hand in hand. And at this point, I think eventually the exhibition started slowing down. People were going to museums rather, or doing other things like traveling. They didn't have to stay in their cities. So exhibitions were sort of filtering out. However, museums still had to keep up. They were like, okay, we gotta modernize, we gotta keep up the times. Like, what do people want? Oh, I gotta keep painting. And so one thing they realized was capitalism, obviously. So have you ever wondered how someone thought about putting a gift shop in a museum? Well, it's because since they had to keep up with department stores were adding museums into their stores. So they would actually frequently buy high art, right? And they would just display that in their stores for the patrons of the store to see while they're doing their shopping. So if you could see a painting at the department store, what is prompting you to go to the museum? Well, the museums were like, okay, you can't have a monopoly on all this. We're gonna have stores too. So eventually they also got souvenir stores. So you could see, like, let's go with Picasso, for example. You could see a Picasso in the museum, go to the gift store and actually touch it, have a tangible version of that Picasso and take it home with you. It's just like how people would be taking home, I don't know, prizes or snacks from the exhibitions. The museum sort of took that idea from them as well. Do you hear the horn? It's my sister. Okay, well, 2 out of 10 nails were flops. So we had an 80% success rate. I'd say that's pretty good for a first timer. So here are the nails. Oh. So they look like. So I hope you liked it. I hope you like my nails, because I do. I will have another video for you next week, and I promise I will. I got my life together this time. And yeah, hope to like today's video. Bye! You've reached the outro. Please like, comment, subscribe. Please subscribe.